Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel Heated Rivalry, Immigration Safety and Queer Belonging in Canada. Thank you so much to the University of British Columbia Centre for Migration Studies for sponsoring this event, and to those at the Centre for making it happen, especially at Maza, who provides events and community engagement support, and also Marie, our communications specialist. As we gather online, we want to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver campus is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We're grateful for their stewardship of the land, as well as the stewardship, enduring presence, and sovereignty of the Indigenous peoples across whose lands we're connected virtually today. We are going to be speaking from and about migration to a country that's built on Indigenous dispossession, including forced displacement and ongoing settler colonial governance. The Canadian state has long relied on racialized systems of citizenship to determine who belongs and who does not, and access to protection and recognition here has always been structured, conditional, and contested. So these tensions are what form the backdrop against which stories like Heated Rivalry imagine Canada as a place of safety and belonging. So whether you're a devoted fan, as some of us are, a critic, as some of us may be, or perhaps both, the Canadian series Heated Rivalry has clearly struck a nerve. This panel arose from a UBC News Q&A called How Heated Rivalry Imagines Canada, which received an unusually high level of engagement and some positive feedback. So this really revealed an appetite to unpack both what makes the show so emotionally compelling and what makes it politically interesting. And we're really grateful to have Dr. Katungal here, who's the author of that Q&A, to share some more thoughts, as long as, in addition to other speakers who have different yet complementary perspective on this topic. So for many viewers, the show is really moving because it offers a fantasy of safety. It presents Canada as an accessible sanctuary where a passport represents legitimacy, protection, and freedom. But as Dr. Katungal notes in that Q&A, access to the sanctuary is highly differentiated. From an immigration perspective, it's structured by long processing times, complex criteria, and systemic barriers. Access to safety is not universal, it's conditional. It's tiered and it's mediated through state power, which is imposing increasingly restrictive border and immigration policies right now in this moment. So on one hand, we hear Prime Minister Mark Carney praising director Jacob Tierney for making the show in Canada, describing the country as one that celebrates difference and upholds the, quote, fundamental Canadian value, unquote, that people should be able to, quote, people should be able to be whoever they want to be and love whoever they want to love, unquote. So on the other hand, we're also living through a period marked by externalized Canadian borders, reductions in humanitarian migration levels, potentially major restrictions on refugee claims, for example, through Bill C-12, and cuts to equity and gender-related programming, such as to Women and Gender Equality Canada. So today's conversation is not necessarily about dismissing the power of representation or downplaying the significance for the show that it has for so many of us, but it's about sitting with the contradictions and reflecting on how narratives of safety, belonging, and nationhood are constructed, reinforced, and contested. We are so fortunate to have an amazing panel of thinkers whose work approaches these tensions from distinct but complementary angles. First, we have Dr. Jean-Paul Katungal, who's an assistant professor in critical race and ethnic studies at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Ali Balgat is an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University's School of Public Policy. And Alex Salim Dungman Manzoor is the co-executive director of programming and advocacy with Rainbow Refuge, which was the first organization in Canada established to support individuals seeking refugee protection due to persecution based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, sex characteristics, or HIV status. And you can read the full bios of all our speakers in the chat. So given that today's conversation is about belonging and access, I also want to acknowledge our panel will be shaped by who's present and who is not. So we have incredible expertise with us today, but the panel does reflect particular gendered positions and it's weighted towards masculine perspectives. And representation does not automatically determine viewpoint. Absence does not mean disengagement, but the composition does shape how the dialogue unfolds, and we want to just hold that reflexively as we begin today's discussion. And finally, you may have noticed that the panel is being recorded. However, we're going to stop the recording at the end for a question and answer period, which will not be recorded. So you can use the Q&A function in the webinar throughout the panel to ask questions, and you can upvote the questions that you like. The questions will be answered at the end. So now, what you have all been waiting for, let's get to it. Let's start by asking each of the panelists to briefly share how they felt about the show from their own positionality and maybe share some opening reflections about the show. So we'll start with JP first, please, and then Ali and then Alex. So over to you, JP.
Thank you so much for, organizing this, for all of the labor that went into bringing us together. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation, and thank you to the attendees for, being part of this panel. I'm very excited to talk about the show. As you can probably tell from my background as well as my sweater, I am both a devoted fan as well as a cultural analyst, if you will, of the show. I bring both perspectives. I also bring the perspective of someone who is a first generation queer Asian Canadian. Um, to the show. That kind of positionality is one that shapes both my academic analysis, but also the way that I approach media and questions of representation. So I wanted to foreground that in the interest of ensuring that my perspectives we understand as, or certainly I understand, and I'd like to emphasize that it is grounded and positioned. It comes from my own embodiment, history, and positionality. So, um, one immediate thought that came to mind for me that I wanted to share is the immediacy with which Heated Rivalry, as the show, invokes the world system of nation states and regimes of citizenship and borders as a structuring narrative device, and also the geopolitical landscape within which the show's romance and sexuality and all of the tensions and that we've come to love as central to the narrative of the show. That is the substrate, the foundation within which the narrative unfolds. Right. Within the first 5 minutes of the show, it's the International Prospects Cup. That's when we first meet the protagonists who represent respectively for Shane, Canada, and Ilya, Russia. This international tournament takes place in and through the form of the nation state, right? So these two characters stand in for not only the nation state, but also the characteristics of the nation state. So we see representations of Shane's Canadianness as studied, composed, and kind of epitome of kind of a Canadian hockey masculinity, in contradistinction to the representation of Ilya and Russia as brash, as big, as boisterous, right? So from the very get-go, we see this representation. And then the second scene, which is the draft, we encounter what these nation states mean for how both Shane and Ilya come to then be positioned as representatives of their nation states. So, in a to me, pivotal moment, the Montreal Metro's executive talks about the historic nature of Shane's being drafted as an Asian Canadian. Just so, we're clear, according to the Metros, this is an exciting moment. It's a historic one. And that already belies or reveals actually the racial politics of hockey as a world, as a business, as an industry, and as a sport. And therefore also as racialization comes to then structure ideas about what Canada is, right? So Shane's Asian Canadianness is key. And there's a kind of throwaway moment in that scene where Shane's mom, Yuna, talks about how hockey comes to be how she and her family came to understand themselves as Canadian, right? So there's also a way that hockey functions as a kind of pedagogical um, tool for racialized folks to understand what Canada is and how they can be part of the nation state, right? It's through this proximity to hockey, right, that we encounter the central force of racialization within the show. And I wanted to begin with that because I really wanted to emphasize that, while we talk about the show quite a lot, as we should, as being about sexuality, right? That is a sexuality that is very much in intersection with race and nation, right? And that is not just true of Shane, it's also true of Ilya. And maybe I'll um, turn it over to someone else and just offer that as an initial set of provocations for discussion.
Okay, I'll go next, I guess. Hi, everyone. I'm Ali. Thank you so much for organizing, Lisa, at Maza, and for all the attendees. I mean, my God, it's so well attended, which I think points to the draw of the show. I wanted to start by saying, I'm an international relations scholar. I'm gay. I'm a migrant settler in this Canadian context. And so similar to JP, that's where my view of the show comes from. I think more like, fan critic, something like that. But in general, like I like the show. It does. It's interesting that it comes up in this moment, as JP suggests, and I think it is part of Canada's wider imaginary, and I think that does some real reputational work. And it matters, right? We're living in this moment of global homo and transphobia, queerphobia in general, and then most nation states, but particularly, I'm thinking about here the UK and the US, but also elsewhere, are really anti-queer at the moment. And then you have this show that's Mark Carney's going and doing promo with the lead actors. So it's fascinating in the way, and I think JP says this really nicely in the interview with basically, well, this is public money, and you're kind of seeing what that looks like and what a queer imaginary of Canada um, is today. And of course, that's disjointed from the lived realities of housing struggles over political belonging, work, and also various forms of desire. I mean, I think we are living as well in I think from being sometimes perhaps chronically online, a moment of particularly Indian hate. And so this is where I'm kind of coming from with respect to this and thinking about the visualizations and the narrative being told. And I thought this show is a really compelling melodrama. It's a fantasy, and I think that's the lens we should view it through. And I think that's important because the those fantasies inform how we think about gender, race, and class. And I think in this opening statement, I'll talk about those three things. And it's interesting that the source material comes from a book about gay men, but catered towards predominantly straight women. And it's fascinating because a while ago, okay, so my mentor of a long, long time, Vilya Jefremovas, who has since retired from Queen's University, who taught me my first qualitative methods class, is really into these, sapphic romances. But a lot of these romances are perhaps, well, maybe sapphic is the wrong word in this context, but these romances are written in by women for women, but often take place with gay men. And, Velia is now much older. And it's interesting that she's got to us because she doesn't really watch TV. And she was like, hey, have you read this book, Heated Rivalry? I believe it's a show now. I'm like, yeah, Amelia, everyone's really talking about it. But it was interesting because in the show itself, we're seeing the invocation of gay male desire. And I think the gaze of the TV show is fascinating because I mean in the popular lexicon, it's often referred to as a gay show. But I think in watching this as a gay man, I viewed it as quite sapphic. And I watched this with my queer friends in Vancouver, and they're all women. And it's interesting how, what JP calls the embracing of bottomhood. I think a lot of, well, the people I watched it with anyway, were kind of relating to the feminine identity of, or the feminization of the characters in these kind of intimate scenes. And so I thought there's an interesting element of gender here because there are actually queer women stories that in professional sports that aren't being told. Um, and I thought that was curious. It's interesting that, the male desire from gay and perhaps straight women audiences or in between, or however you want to call it, are it is in kind of the political economy and imaginary of Canada more. I guess this is where the money is, perhaps. And perhaps it's pointing us to the intersections of desire and money. And so that's my, provocation on gender. On race, I was thinking, okay, there's an element here, we see a markedly accented Ilya and biracial Shane. And but then what I was really thinking about was the arc by between Scott and Kip. And it's fascinating because of course they're both like these ripped muscle gods, and obviously we're seeing this in like high fantasy. But what I do find interesting about that is how this fantasy production is wrapped up in whiteness and that type of white gay identity. And this brings me to a little bit about the class bit as well. So I think as everyday people, we're supposed to see ourselves in Kip, who is like a barista or a smoothie shop operator. And it's this like, mega jock dream hockey player falls for him. And the fantasy in this context is that class doesn't matter. And there's this huge attraction between them, but it's based basically on very little context. And I'm totally there, right? I'm totally there saying, okay, with regards to a hookup, makes perfect sense. But then you kind of see this relationship develop. And I think it's meant to be the flattening of class dynamic to show that social homophobia that still persists, even in a country like Canada or the US, where, okay, for this particular subset of people, this is meant to be disappeared. And we're seeing, super rich hockey players here in these dream apartments as well. And so, but that actually brings me back to race because I felt watching this as, oh, this is primarily a fantasy through a white gay male lens, and that I'm not sure I feel this type of desire ascribed to dark skin or racialized bodies in the media in this kind of ultra hot, high, heavily produced, fetishized way. And I wonder what that leaves us with, because on one hand, the fantasy is transversing class divides, and I think a lot of people don't talk about class divides when we're, in intimate relationships or dating, because I think people do still more or less date within their class. And so that's one element that the show fantasizes about. The other one is, okay, you see this relationship develop. Kip's friends are people of color, and really powerfully shown, but the desire still seems to be between these kind of lighter skinned bodies. But anyways, in general, I'll leave it at that and I have lots to say, but yeah, I loved it. I think it's amazing that it exists. But again, it's interesting how the fantasies that show up, whether it be about nation states, migrants, and so forth on TV, reveal or are a mirror back to our own society. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you, JP and Abby. Um, First, I want to say that, well, my name is Alex and I use they, them pronouns, and the name of my organization is Rainbow Refugee Society, and we go by Rainbow Refugee. Um, and I want to say thank you also to UBC Center for Migration Studies for thinking of us. I do not come from an academic lens to speak with you today. So, but it's very much aligned with what JP and Ali has said already. First of all, I want to begin where I think all conversations should begin is by saying who I am and who my people are. I am a transgender Palestinian. I was born and raised in Santiago de Chile. So I carry the histories of people who have been told again and again that they do not belong where they are, that their love is a threat, that their bodies are political problems that need to be managed. So I hold multiple experiences of migration and displacements and diaspora. I am a first generation Chilean on my father's side. I am a third generation on my mother's side. I was a migrant as a child in Chicago, and now I'm a migrant here in Canada as an adult. My trans identity is not incidental to the work that I do. It is a source of some of my greatest resilience, my deepest joy, my most profound sense of beauty in the world. And it is also the reason I understand in my bones what it means to be visible in ways that make you vulnerable. To be seen as something that others feel entitled to have opinions about, to legislate, or to erase. I say this because in the tradition of the indigenous people whose land, whose unceded land we gather today, so the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, we are asked to know our relations and to say where we come from, and ultimately to be accountable to our ancestors for how we show up every day, not only in the work as people, as humans, but also in the construction of Canadian society and in this imaginary that Heated Rivalry wants to bring forward that we may want to have, in a way, in some aspects, become reality, and in others, we also recognize that it has been whitewashed, and some of the cultural pieces of queerness of color have really not been represented, as Ali was also mentioning, and maybe we do not feel represented by this imaginary, although it is important that it is out there, and I don't want to minimize that. So I come to this conversation as someone whose existence sits at the intersection of many of the things the show is trying imperfectly and also beautifully to imagine, like queerness, migration, belonging, and the question of who gets to be safe. And I watched Heated Rivalry with real feeling. Like it moved me. I thought it was great. I enjoy the sex scenes. I enjoy the emotional scenes. I enjoy the evolution of the characters from having this very superficial relationship to actually creating a meaningful emotional connection. And I was particularly struck by the scene on episode 5 between Ilya and Shane that says where Ilya says that if he embraces his identity in an open way, he may not be able to go back to Russia. That his father is a police, that his brother is police, and this is not fiction for me, you know. That is the testimony that I hear from people at that Rainbow Refugee supports every single week. And the show does something rare, which I really like, which is to make you feel the cost of being hidden. So you do get a little bit of the taste of what is the cost of being hidden. And I think that they try to kind of place and say, hey, it is not the same for a person who's in Canada who may not have an experience of migration in coming out as queer, although it may be difficult and there are so many complexities, than a person like Ilya, who is connected to a nation state that would actually effectively, actively persecute Ilya, and not only the state, but also society and his family who is connected to the state. So the way Ilya holds the weight of a whole country's violence inside a single sentence, which says, I wouldn't be able to go home again ever. That is the sentiment. I wouldn't be able to go home again ever. That is not dramatic writing. I want to say that is a real calculation that LGBTQ people from around the world have to make every day. And the fantasy that the show offers, so what is the fantasy, is that Canada is a place where you could be safe, where a relationship like theirs could be possible. That's the Canadian fantasy. So the reality is people go through this around the world every day. They may not be able to go back to their home countries. They're making this mathematical calculations about the risk to their lives. And the fantasy is Canada is a place you could be safe, where a relationship like yours can be possible. And I understand why that fantasy is very powerful. And in certain ways, there is a reality to that fantasy. It's not absolutely just a fantasy. But for many people watching around the world, Canada exists as a symbol. But I work in the gap between the fantasy and the reality, the imaginary of what Canada actually does. So the representation of a Canada that welcomes and embraces LGBTQI people cannot be separated from the intersecting realities of race, class, migration status, and the systems of power that decides who get to ask access to that welcome. And homonationalism, or the use of LGBTQI rights as a marker of national progress and civilizational superiority, does not translate into safety for everyone who arrives here. It is a story that Canada tells about itself, often to distinguish itself from the very countries its policies are now trying to or starting to imitate. So today, what I want to ask and how I want to finish this first intervention is to say, what does it mean to celebrate this show's vision of Canada while simultaneously passing legislation that would make Ilya ineligible to claim asylum here? And that is just grounding us in what really happens. And I will stop at that and bring it back to you, Lisa.
Amazing. Thank you all three so very much. I think what we can do now is I'll ask a question to each of you, but there's so much to unpack from what has already been said from the other speakers. So I'll present something, but please feel free to also respond to what the other speakers have said. We'll go back to you first, JP, and how you talked in your opening about how the show constructs this particular vision of racialized Canadian nationhood, and you also hinted at a kind of reading of that through Ilya's character as well. So race is clearly a key component of this show that I think, as you rightly mentioned, Ali, like is maybe not always picked up on as much. So, JP, could you expand a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. I just want to say that, Ali, Alex, your perspectives are really amazing and so insightful. And I am particularly in awe, Alex, of the way that you bring your work in onto our discussion, that perspective, the beautiful way that you talk about the gap between the reality and the fantasy as the site of your work. I am in awe of how beautifully insightful that is. One thing that I'm sorry, Lisa, I'm being very disobedient here, or maybe not, but I really want to hone in on the passport as a technology of citizenship because it comes up quite a lot in this show as a stand-in for the kinds of issues that the three of us in different ways have begun talking about. The passport or the desire for a Canadian passport is like a central narrative pr- uh a central aspect of the narrative and one of the key like frictions of Shane and Ilya's relationship and marriage, and particularly hetero marriage, right? Kind of as a way to skirt around regimes of citizenship, right? I could marry Svetlana, dagger eyes, but also we'll figure something else out, right? So both in this case, marriage as a solution to this problem of the Russian passport in Ilya's case, but also getting drafted by Ottawa, being traded to Ottawa also becomes another workaround to, fix this issue of citizenship, right? I those aspects of the narrative are really indicative to me of the kind of central force of nation states and its and the border and citizenship regimes that come to be part of that. In terms of the question of race, in relation to these border and immigration regimes, this kind of promise of a safe Canada, perhaps arguably represented in the cottage as a space of seclusion, and I want like safety, but also seclusion, right? of hiding, but also private property, actually, away from surveillance. I think that's also something that we might maybe pick up on a little bit more later. But I wanted to hone in on the kind of racial politics of this kind of like the secluded safety, right? And the uneven availability of that for differently positioned migrant communities, right? Like obviously, or maybe not obviously, um, Ilya and Shane talk about immigration and the kind of problem of the passport so easily because they are positioned in this world as multimillionaire hockey players who are desired for desired for because of their subject's position in that way, right? So the world of hockey is a world of citizenship and immigration that opens doors easier, right, than others. They are arguably labor, well, Ilya is arguably a labor migrant, right? But we would never understand, or that will never be the framing for a hockey player, right? And similarly with professors, like a lot of my colleagues are labor migrants as such, who come here from all over the world, but they will never be framed as that or even describe themselves as that, right? So that's also another thing is that it spotlights the differentiated regimes, and these are racialized and classed ones, right? At base, intersectionally, and I think that's really important. And the last thing I'll say in relation to race and nation, which concerns the cottage, is the regime of private property that I want to pick up on. I appreciate the way that, we began the seminar and also Alex, in particular, emphasized, that, we are doing this work in the context of ongoing indigenous sovereignty and also ongoing settler colonialism, right? The fantasy of the cottage as a private property of seclusion is one that is reliant upon a history of Canadian settler colonialism, right? The possibilities, however precarious they are, for Shane and Ilya to be able to find some kind of home or safety, right? That is enabled by the cottage as a quintessential Canadian landscape form, um, and one that is enabled by kind of settler colonial regimes of property ownership. So I'll leave it there for now, and then hopefully we'll pick up a bit more.
Thank you, JP. Um, Alex, same for you. Feel free to respond to what you would like, but I just want to echo what JP said about your comments. We're really fortunate to have your perspective on the gap between fantasy and reality and what you've seen through your work with the organization. We're talking about a show that's based on Canada functioning narratively as this emotional and political refuge. Can you talk a little bit more about what the show simplifies or obscures about the granting of safety, whether how it's denied or delayed, etc., in real life in Canada?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'm going to follow the question in this time. What I do want to say is that, Heated Rivalry represents Canada in a way as emotionally and politically accessible. That is a simplification. You arrive, you are safe, you can love who you love. Like that's the kind of like the fantasy, right? Like you arrive, you're safe, you love who you love. The passport, the border crossing, these are almost like incidentals. How you got here, what did you have to do? If you were even able to cross a border, let's just think that the only way people can get to Canada is either by taking a plane. So you have to have some sort of visa that would allow you to arrive to Canada, or by crossing the US border into Canada. And with the Safe Third Country Agreement and all these border security things, it's been almost practically impossible. So it's like, oh, you arrive, but do we even think about, can't people arrive in the first place? Like that is, um, yeah. So what does the show what does the show not offer you or show you, because it would break the fantasy, right? Like it would completely break the fantasy, is the system that greets you when you actually arrive. First, the long wait times, the possibility of immigration detention. I always feel extremely shocked to learn how many Canadians do not even know or are aware that we in Canada have immigration detention centers in BC. There's one in Surrey. There's one in Ontario. There's one Laval in Montreal. And that we do not only detain individuals, we also detain families with children. There are children who are being raised in immigration detention centers, if you didn't know, here in Canada. Now, it might be the conditions may be different than the ones in the US, but that doesn't make it not so that there are not children who are actually in detention. We do have children in detention. We have complex eligibility criteria. We have hearings where you're asked to prove with documents and testimonies that your queerness is real enough, that your fear is credible enough, that your danger is legible enough to the federal government. Canada is not simply a refuge, it is a highly differentiated system that grants safety conditionally, tiered by country of origins in many cases, in immigration status, in how you arrive, and increasingly, and with Bill C-12, how soon you arrived. So I want to make this concrete because concrete is where lives are actually lived. It's not in the fantasy like it is in the reality. And Bill C-12, which is Strengthening Canada's Immigration System and Borders Act, and I'm saying the name for those of you, I don't want to give you a summary of the bill. That wouldn't be conductive, but if you want to do a research later. If Bill C-12 were law today, Ilya Rosanov, the character whose story moves so many of us, would not be eligible to make a refugee claim in Canada. Okay, like that's the reality. If Ilya were to come out openly, for instance, and say, I am gay, like he was, and I'm never able to go back to Russia, he may have, of course, because he has access to power and other kind of migrations to other migration pathways. But if he were to choose to do a refugee claim under Bill C-12, if it were to become law, he would have a 1-year bar. So if you have been in Canada for more than a year before making a refugee claim, you are deemed ineligible according to this bill if it were to become law. It does not ask why it took you that long. It does not account for the reality of LGBTQI people, especially those who are deeply closeted, who live in fear of exposure, who are navigating careers and public identities, that often takes years to reach to the point where they can name what is happening to them and then say, okay, I actually need protection from this. We see in Heated Rivalry that Ilya's story spans in years. He's embedded in professional hockey. He's deeply closeted. He has a family that is literally part of the state apparatus that would persecute him. And under Bill C-12, the very complexity of his situation, the thing that makes his story so human, becomes a legal barrier. Because the rule is you have to claim asylum within the first time that you arrive in Canada. And Ilya has various, and I don't remember anymore, but it's been spam, and he was in Montreal and he was in Ottawa. So the year has passed. Let's assume the year has passed. And they are drafted as a political response, as defensiveness, as opportunism. These rules are not drafted with Ilya in mind. They are political instruments, they're in defensiveness, they're opportunism. That sacrifices people like him to scapegoat refugees as the cause of economic anxiety and security concerns that really have nothing to do with refugees. If we were to look why we're in the place we are, what is going on with housing, it's just really bad policies around housing for years. But then we want to scapegoat migrants and refugees and put them pitted against each other. And also there is an international contradiction. Like Canada presents itself as its best self on the international stage and on television. But we are not living our best selves right now. We're actively copying the worst policy impulses of countries we should never be following. The international landscape as we knew it, with multilateral accountability, rule of law, international protection frameworks, have shifted profoundly, and I may say I don't even know if it's alive today, considering what the international landscape is teaching us. The past few years have demonstrated with painful clarity who gets held accountable and who is permitted to violate human rights without consequences. I mean, and that makes it a joke, and people just don't believe in it anymore. There is no real accountability. So we cannot outsource our conscience to international bodies that have proven unequal to the task. And we have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to decide what kind of country we're going to be, not in the stories we tell about ourselves, but in the policies that we actually implement in Canada.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Alex. I know that Marie is putting in a chat a report that was recently published by a Center for Migration Studies affiliate about racialization and detention in Canada. It just came out, and I think it might be interesting. And we'll also be putting some links in the chat for people to read more about Bill C-12 and some of the actions people can take if they want. It's currently about to have its third reading in the Senate, so there's still time to speak out against the bill if people are interested. Ali, I think your research really complements so much of what Alex has just shared. You've researched about these complex journeys that people endure and navigate in trying to reach safety. And I know your research has also described queer refugees as, quote, misfits in the global political economy of migration, which I think brings in this, economic class element. And would really love to hear your thoughts and reflections following Alex's comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, your comments are really, really important. I think they really reflect, what academics have been trying to say, though you're saying it much more lucidly. I think that the thing about Ilya that's fascinating, even though Ilya wouldn't be able to claim refugee or get asylum in Canada, is this kind of class dynamic. And I think it's similar to what JP was saying, that who we classify as labor migrants versus, and therefore, in general, who we see as authentic, deserving, or undeserving are important questions. They prop up entire migration regimes. I guess I'd answer your question, Lisa, by drawing on, I mean, so, I've worked over the last decade in now 4 countries, South Africa, France, Kenya, and now the US, on this topic, largely of queer global displacement, I'd call it. And I think I use the term misfits to describe this kind of structural mismatch because migration systems in general are designed around ideal migrant categories, whether they be productive workers, families, perhaps, politically legible refugees, especially with respect to conflict. And queer refugees often don't fit those categories neatly, and I think there's a lot of variance and with respect to what Alex was saying as well. I think in some countries, like in South Africa and Kenya, there are forms of persecution, what's understood as family life, or perhaps even economic, violence, or the violence of economic inequality in general. They fall out, these assumptions built into asylum and migration regimes. And it's fascinating because, in a country like Kenya, okay, homosexuality is illegal, and therefore you would expect not that many people claiming asylum, and you can't in some ways, but then you have international organizations that have various safe houses for queer people. And so that's interesting, right? There's safety in a small community, and there's also the abject violence, perhaps, of society as well. In South Africa, which obviously has a very progressive constitution, what we really see is a mix here. There's no encampment, but you are seeing, Home Affairs officials saying, well, it's wrong, you should read the Bible, it's wrong to be gay in the Bible. Or at one point, I remember one of my interlocutors said, their Home Affairs official said, "Well, Mugabe said there's no gays in Zimbabwe, so you're lying because you're gay, and that doesn't matter." So that I think that's interesting. I think there's various regimes that are at play. I feel like Canada is probably similar to France, where then the burden of authenticity. So I think in countries like South Africa and Kenya, if you're a queer asylum seeker, you might try to find other ways, a more concrete way, perhaps vis-a-vis conflict or something of that nature, or being a political migrant or a political asylum seeker. In France and perhaps in Canada, what you see is an overemphasis of saying you're authentic, right? To le le create a legitimacy around your story about being queer, right? I discovered my identity in this way, and this happened to me at this age, and this is how I can fit into this, umbrella of terms that we have. And I think that's really interesting. And that's to answer your question, I think that's where the misfits are. There's a terrain of policy that's not quite formed yet, and I think people are still uncomfortable with how to deal with it. And of course, in the US, in the context that I'm working currently, in the Los Angeles context where I'm exploring detention and deportation, particularly of trans and queer migrants, the solid claims, often lawyers would say one of the most solid claims you could have made on your asylum was based on queer and trans identity. And that's completely been reversed, right? It's just, and the laws are being broken, I think it's safe to say. But what's actually happening is there's this lived backlash against queer and trans people, particularly from the global South. And again, we're seeing this misfit, right? Because for a lot of trans people claiming asylum, it's not just about human rights. It's not just about the passport. It's not just about, green cards or citizenship. It's also just life. It's we cannot work, and therefore we're put into or forced into survival related sex work, even though people don't necessarily want to do that. That's how your marked body operates in even a very progressive city like LA, and I'm sure in Vancouver too. So, anyways, that's sort of my scattered thoughts on that. But thank you so much for the question. I could go on and on.
Thank you so much, Ali. I think we have some amazing questions in the chat. People, audience members, if you want to add some, please go ahead and use the Q&A function. You can also vote for what question you'd like answered. Maybe we'll go for one or two more questions before turning to the Q&A from the audience. And this one I'll put out to all three panelists, and you can share as you'd like in response. I think one thing that's been really interesting about the show is this instrumentalizing of Canada as a place of refuge in these nationalist projects and Canadian branding. And I'm wondering what you think about how we can walk this line between defending queer and trans rights while also avoiding instrumentalizing them. Or is it bad to instrumentalize them? Or, what does it mean that, Mark Carney is so excited to get this jacket and celebrate, the fact that this show was made in Canada, and the fact that, like, I immigrated to Canada as an adult from the US, and a lot of my friends in the US who are, also part of the queer community with me are like really like I'm jealous. I wish I could go to Canada, making these discussions about how Canada is so much better than the US, and it just really papers over the realities, I think. So I'm curious to hear from the panel your thoughts on this.
Well, I can start if that's okay. I think the tension between, instrumentalizing queer rights and national projects while defending them is like one of the most important tensions in this conversation. And I do not think that it has an easy answer. Um, Homo nationalism is real, and the use of LGBTQI rights as a weapon um, to justify border restrictions, to paint certain countries as backwards, to position Canada or Europe as civilizationally superior, causes real harm. It weaponizes queerness against the very communities it claims to protect, and it links LGBTQI liberation to imperial and nationalist projects. It really does that. And yet, the rights are real. The persecution is real. Ilya's fear and so many, hundreds of thousands of people around the world of going back to their home countries is real. So we cannot so theoretically sophisticated. We cannot be so theoretically sophisticated about the politics of rights that we leave people without protection. So at one point we may have this academic, um, critiques of homo nationalism and the use and the weaponization of rights. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that we want to completely obliterate the rights just so that they are not used in such a way, because the persecution continues to be real, and unless we are going to be replacing the system that we have with something better, at this point, I wouldn't recommend that we just get rid of it in that way, in that radical way. So the way I try to hold this is this: defend the rights robustly, but refuse to let the state own the narrative. And I think that's where we come in as well. We do need to put different narratives and kind of ground what we're saying. We need to push back when LGBTQ rights are invoked to close borders rather than open them. We need to insist that there has to be a genuine commitment to queer safety, and that means welcoming those fleeing persecution, not just celebrating domestically visible queerness while turning away those who need asylum. And the test of whether Canada genuinely values LGBTQI lives is not in what it says about itself. It is not what we're saying. It's not Carney wearing a hockey jacket going and talking about inclusion and diversity and how we stand. Those are just words, and we can say words about ourselves all day long. It is whether someone like Ilya and other thousands of people, real people whose stories he represents, although of course he represents a very particular one, but also in general many, can actually get here and stay here safely. I think that's what's important for us to think about with regards to this instrumentalization. I think we do need to think about what are the better systems that we want to put in place. We do need to uphold, in the meantime, this rights-based protection, but we need to be very real about the narratives and who's controlling the narrative when we're talking about protection of queerness, and not have a narrative that is white center, that this is what a queer person looks like, this is what an identity looks like, this is what protection looks like, and really talk about belonging and not just inclusion. And really talk about where is meaning coming from. Do I, as a trans Palestinian who is also Chilean and a migrant in Canada, do I have the ability here in Canada, or am I permitted to make meaning here in Canada? Am I contributed to that meaning, or I'm just the other? I'm just the other who's invited in. I'm just the other who sometimes gets to play, who sometimes gets to live, am I the other, or am I also a source of meaning in Canadian society? Do I contribute? Do I get to make the policies? Who is in power? The up the ladder we go. Who do we see in power? And I don't mean only necessarily skin color, in the sense, do I get to see people of color in ministry? We do get to see people of color in different ministry, but they actually behave in a white supremacist context and act and enact white supremacy, because they also are there to survive. They also feel the impacts in their own bodies. Like I don't want to judge them, but because at the same time I say it's real. Like white supremacy is something real that really affects all of us. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, that's my contribution.
Yeah, I think that's super well said, and I have a very brief point on it. And I think for me, the I think instrumentalization happens when there's a disconnect between the fantasy and the lived reality. And I think what's missing there is that there's all sorts of there's federal jurisdictions, provincial jurisdictions, what happens in our cities, the neoliberal kind of uh, downloading of risk onto our urban spaces. I think all of that's happening, coupled with a housing crisis. I think these are the structures that are there. I think the Carney jacket promo stuff is, on one hand, building the kind of, jurisdiction of Canada as, yeah, this is actually still a safe space where no one else might be. But I think the disconnect happens when the materiality of queer life is not taken into account. And I think that's partly what I was meaning by the kind of misfits in political economy thing that I've written at some point. I think what's going on there is, queer people aren't just their gender identity or sexuality, it's also work, housing, and and access to various spaces. And I think that's where the instrumentalization happens because there's an overemphasis perhaps on, as Alex was saying, a rights-based freedom, rights-based approaches and rights-based freedom and that sort of stuff. But you can't eat rights. And that, I think, sometimes is where the disconnect happens. Though, I mean, it's really important to have them, and it's really important to have access to citizenship because that facilitates other stuff. But at the same time, there's a disconnect between the fantasy and the material everyday life of, the queer experience.
I'll say that one way that I'm reading instrumentalization is through the affect of smugness that it relies on. The instrumentalization allows Canada to be smug about itself and its status in the world. It becomes a means through which Canada just says, this is just Canadianness. We're welcoming, we're tolerant. It becomes the endpoint of discussion. It becomes the narrative instead of many other things that are actually important to discuss as part of the making of Canada, even provisionally as a space of safety and refuge. A lot of it wasn't just, some benevolent state agent or whatever, a father figure, and I say that deliberately, that has somehow made Canada safe. It required a lot of work, a lot of activism from people on the ground, right? To, hold um, decision makers to account for, um, in order to create an environment where even the remotest possibility of safety and refuge is possible. So the invisibilization of the activism and the work and the organizing, the on the ground labor, I think, is part of what's hidden when we begin with this smug premise of this is just Canadianness, right? The other thing that's hidden, or well, the other effect of the smugness is that it translates into a certain kind of social debt that immigrants and refugees now owe to Canada. You should just be grateful that you're here, right? Which in many ways forecloses the possibility of critique. And one of the, especially from the lived experiences of migrants and refugees, right, who have a lot to tell us about the limitations of the current regimes of border citizenship and immigration from their lived experiences. I should also say our lived experiences because that's something that I too navigate as a first generation immigrant, right? So this demand for gratitude, right, is part of that instrumentalization. It becomes a means through which migrants and refugees are reduced to people who received a gift of Canadian freedom and generosity rather than analysts of the very systems that shape our lives. Right. So that's the other thing. And then the third thing I'll say in relation to instrumentalization is that one effect of the smugness of Canada the Good being the endpoint of a narrative is that it hides all of the other important work that still needs to happen. Right. So, and I go back to what Alex said earlier around, if we trace the footsteps of refugees and migrants across the border, we might pay attention to, their encounter with border agents, but also we also should understand that if and when they land here, they need to deal with um, labor regimes. They need to deal with housing, right? They need to deal with everyday life, and the robustness of support, right? And the struggles that immigrants and refugees face in differentiated ways, depending on what tier or pathway they take. right? These real material realities tell us that there's still a lot of work to be done e beyond crossing the border, right? So what happens now, right? What happens once people are here, right? When they get here, if they get here, right? And the if is a really important question that I think Alex um, forces us to face up to because that is never a guarantee, right? So those to me are some of the ways that I think about instrumentalization in its politics.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, luckily, people who are interested in continuing this conversation can hear more from JP because he's going to be giving a talk March 11th. And there's going to be a link in the chat that's also virtual, so people can attend and it's open to the public. And JP has also put together this really amazing Heated Rivalry syllabus, which we will link in the chat so you can do further reading. Maybe we'll have to have a part two of this conversation sometime. Maybe season two, we'll revisit the conversation. The chat will also have a link to Ali's research website so you can read his book, new book, upcoming book, and some papers there, and also Alex's organization, Rainbow Refugee, the campaign against Bill C-12. Thank you so much, everyone, for sitting with this complexity today. We really look forward to seeing you at future UBC Center for Migration Studies events. And finally, thank you so much to the panelists. This has been Admaza and I have been so excited about this, Marie as well. We're just really, really grateful that you took the time to share your thoughts, and they've been super insightful and very, very clarifying. So thank you all, and thanks to the audience for attending.
Thank you, everyone. I really hope season 2 of Heated Rivalry actually responds to more of the reality. Let's see what happens.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you
Thanks,
to my
everyone.
fellow panelists. That was really
Yeah, it was really good.
insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.